November 17, 1944, 3:42 p.m. Northern Burma, Mon-yu Sector. Temperature 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity 87%. The roar of a Nabri 50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun shattered the afternoon silence, sending flocks of parrots screaming from the canopy overhead. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji's staff car, a requisitioned 1939 Nissan Type 180, painted in standard Imperial Japanese Army olive drab with hand-painted recognition markings on the hood, erupted in a shower of sparks and shredded metal as armor-piercing rounds tore through its thin skin. The Americans had found him. Inside the lead M3 half-track, Sergeant James McCarthy of the 475th Infantry Regiment kept his finger pressed on the trigger of the Browning, the massive weapon bucking against its M49 ring mount, as he poured fire into the Japanese command vehicle 200 yards down the muddy jungle road. The weapon cycled at 550 rounds per minute, each 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round traveling at 2,910 feet per second. The brass casings, each one nearly 4 inches long, ejected in a continuous stream, raining onto the steel deck below with a sound like falling coins. McCarthy's hands were slick with sweat inside his gloves. His ears rang despite the cotton wadding he'd stuffed in them before the patrol began. His eyes watered from the acrid smoke and heat shimmer rising from the Browning's barrel, but his aim held steady, the tracers every 5th round showing him exactly where his fire was going. This wasn't supposed to happen. Japanese officers didn't travel in exposed vehicles this close to the front, not anymore, not after months of hard lessons about American mobile firepower. But there it was, clear as day through his sights. A staff car with command pennants moving at speed, flanked by 2 escort motorcycles and what looked like a Type 95 scout car bringing up the rear. McCarthy wasn't about to let it escape. The first burst caught the Nissan's engine block, punching through the thin hood and detonating something vital inside. Steam and coolant sprayed into the air. The vehicle lurched violently to the right, its driver fighting the wheel. McCarthy adjusted his aim, walking his fire across the passenger compartment. The thin doors, designed to stop nothing more than pistol rounds, might as well have been made of rice paper. Behind him in the half-track, Private First Class David Chen, the squad's radio man, was screaming into the handset, "Contact! Contact! Grid 7904-423! Japanese command vehicle engaging now." The reply crackled back through static. "Roger that, Able 2. Bravo 3 moving to your position. Charlie 6 has your 6. 2 more M3s somewhere behind them on the jungle trail, racing forward to support." But in that moment, McCarthy and his crew were alone, 200 yards from an unknown number of Japanese forces, committed to an engagement they'd stumbled into by accident. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most controversial figures and the brutal reality of jungle warfare, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you these forgotten stories of combat every week, and your support helps us keep digging into the archives. Now, to understand the sheer shock that rippled through the Japanese 33rd Army when news of this engagement spread, you need to know who Colonel Masanobu Tsuji really was. Born on October 11, 1902, in Ishikawa Prefecture, Japan, Tsuji was no ordinary officer. By 1944, he had earned a reputation that made even his own superiors nervous. The Americans had a CIA file on him that called him the type of man who, given the chance, would start World War III without any misgivings. His Japanese colleagues called him the god of operations, Sakusen no Kami. His enemies called him something far worse, the devil of the Pacific. Tsuji's rise through the Imperial Japanese Army was meteoric and controversial. At 16, he entered the Nagoya Preparatory Military School, where his instructors noted his extraordinary intelligence paired with an almost pathological determination. He graduated from the Army War College in 1928, having studied Russian and Chinese languages, and immediately threw himself into the Army's political intrigues. By 1934, he was an active member of the Toseiha, the Control faction, fighting against the rival Kodoha, the Imperial Way faction, for dominance of Army policy. When the Kodoha attempted a coup d'etat that year, Tsuji helped block it, earning him powerful patrons, General Hideki Tojo, future Prime Minister, and General Seishiro Itagaki, future War Minister. In 1937, as a staff officer with the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, Tsuji developed a reputation for aggressive, unauthorized actions, what the Japanese called gekokujo, the bottom overthrowing the top, or loyal insubordination. In March 1939, after a border clash with Soviet forces at Changkufeng, Tsuji led 40 men to within 200 yards of Russian outposts. In full view of astonished Soviet guards, he had his men line up, undo their trousers, urinate toward the Russian positions, then sit down and eat boxed lunches while singing military songs. They left behind gifts of meat, chocolate, and whiskey for the puzzled Soviets before withdrawing. It was classic Tsuji, theatrical, provocative, calculated to send a message, but his aggressive border policies led directly to disaster at Nomonhan in summer 1939. Tsuji drafted operational orders that essentially gave local commanders free rein to attack across the Mongolian border whenever they perceived a threat. When Mongolian forces crossed into disputed territory, Japanese commanders felt obligated to respond with overwhelming force. The result was a border war with the Soviet Union that Japan lost catastrophically. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, who would go on to become the Soviet Union's greatest war hero, the man who defended Moscow and captured Berlin, commanded a mechanized force that surrounded and destroyed the Japanese 23rd Division. Soviet artillery, armor, and air power pulverized Japanese forces who'd expected a small border skirmish. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died. Tsuji narrowly escaped. The defeat should have ended his career. Instead, his powerful patrons got him transferred to Taiwan, where he helped establish the Army's Jungle Warfare School in January 1941. This assignment would prove crucial to Japan's coming war, because Tsuji was the architect of Japan's lightning conquest of Malaya and Singapore in 1942, and it remains one of the most brilliant military campaigns of World War II. In the months before Pearl Harbor, Tsuji conducted extensive personal reconnaissance throughout Malaya. Disguised as a civilian, sometimes wearing Arab clothing, he traveled the peninsula from Singapore to the Thai border, photographing defensive positions, mapping road networks, timing river crossings, noting fuel depots and supply dumps. He memorized the terrain with photographic precision. His plan for the invasion was audacious. Instead of a slow, methodical advance, he proposed a high-speed thrust down Malaya's western road network using yes, thousands of bicycles, to move infantry faster than motorized transport could manage in the jungle. Military orthodoxy said it was impossible. The British defensive line at Jitra was considered impregnable. The jungle was impenetrable. Singapore was Fortress Britain, the Gibraltar of the East, garrisoned by 85,000 troops with coastal artillery and naval. Tsuji didn't care about orthodoxy. When the invasion launched on December 8, 1941, concurrent with Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces on bicycles raced south faster than British forces could establish defensive lines. Where bridges were destroyed, soldiers carried their bicycles through streams. Where roads were cratered, they pushed through jungle trails. They moved at night when British doctrine said night operations in jungle terrain were impossible. At Jitra, Tsuji's forces initially attacked based on incorrect intelligence that underestimated British strength by half. It should have been a disaster. Instead, 500 Japanese soldiers, attacking with extraordinary aggression and accepting horrific casualties, broke through and sent British forces reeling back. The campaign became a masterclass in speed, initiative, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Tsuji personally led reconnaissance patrols deep behind British lines. He coordinated amphibious flanking movements that repeatedly outmaneuvered British defensive positions. He improvised solutions to logistical problems on the fly, sometimes personally supervising the repair of bridges or the establishment of river crossings while under fire. The Japanese advance covered 600 miles in 70 days, faster than the German blitzkrieg through France. British forces, expecting a slow jungle campaign with time to prepare successive defensive lines, were constantly caught off balance, retreating before they could properly dig in. On February 15, 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commander of British forces in Malaya, surrendered Singapore to Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita. It was the largest surrender in British military history. 85,000 Commonwealth troops laid down their arms to a Japanese force of roughly equal size that was nearly out of ammunition and supplies. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, Chief of Operations and Planning for the 25th Army, had orchestrated it. At age 39, he was a national hero in Japan, the brilliant tactician who'd humbled the British Empire. School children learned his name. Newspapers celebrated his genius. The emperor himself took notice. But brilliance and brutality walked hand in hand with this man. After the fall of Singapore, Tsuji orchestrated the Sukching massacres, where anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 ethnic Chinese civilians were systematically murdered. He personally oversaw executions at the Pantingan River. During the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, he pushed for the execution of all American prisoners and encouraged the casual murder and torture that killed thousands. In August 1944, witnesses reported something that shocked even hardened war correspondents. Tsuji ordered an American airman, Lieutenant Benjamin Parker, beheaded with a dull Burmese blade. It took 3 hacks to sever the man's head. Then Tsuji had part of the dead man's thigh cut away, roasted on skewers, and served to his officers. Some ate, some didn't. Tsuji proclaimed, "The more we consume, the more we shall be inspired by a hostile spirit towards the enemy," and ate his portion without hesitation. This was the man American forces were facing in northern Burma in late 1944. But let's return to that November afternoon. How did we get here? Why was the god of operations even in Burma? And why were American half-tracks hunting Japanese staff cars in the jungle? The answer lies in a catastrophic Japanese failure 5 months earlier. In March 1944, Imperial General Headquarters launched Operation Yugo, an ambitious, some would say delusional, invasion of India designed to cut Allied supply lines to China and trigger an Indian uprising against British rule. 3 Japanese divisions, totaling roughly 100,000 men, crossed the Chindwin River and drove into India toward the cities of Imphal and Kohima. The operation was the brainchild of Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, commander of the Japanese 15th Army. Mutaguchi was a man of immense confidence and limited logistical sense. He believed that speed, aggression, and Japanese warrior spirit could overcome the mathematical realities of supply lines, ammunition stocks, and food reserves. Tsuji wasn't involved in the planning of Yugo, but he watched from his post in Nanking, China, where he'd been essentially exiled after his disastrous performance at Guadalcanal in 1942. That defeat had cost him his reputation as the infallible god of operations. At Guadalcanal, Tsuji had underestimated American firepower, insisted on frontal assaults against entrenched positions, and refused to acknowledge that the Americans could fight with determination equal to Japanese forces. He'd told Imperial General Headquarters after the defeat, "I deserve 10,000 deaths." But Yugo failed even more spectacularly than Guadalcanal, and in ways that foreshadowed Japan's inevitable defeat in the war. Mutaguchi's operational plan was built on a foundation of wishful thinking. He ordered his divisions to carry only 3 weeks of ammunition and food, with explicit instructions to live off the land and capture British supply dumps. The Japanese euphemistically called this strategy Churchill rations. They would eat British food, fire British ammunition, and drive British vehicles. The plan assumed British forces would retreat as they had in 1942. It assumed the monsoon rains would hold off until Japanese forces had secured their objectives. It assumed that speed and aggression could substitute for proper logistics. And it assumed that Indian nationalist forces would rise up against British rule once Japanese forces crossed the border. Every single assumption was wrong. Lieutenant General William Slim, commander of the British 14th Army, was a very different kind of opponent than the colonial forces Tsuji had faced in Malaya. Slim was a working-class officer who'd risen through merit rather than social connections. He understood logistics. He understood combined arms warfare. He understood his soldiers, British, Indian, Gurkha, and African, and knew how to fight in Burma's impossible terrain. Slim's defensive plan for Imphal and Kohima was brilliant in its simplicity. Let the Japanese advance deep into India, stretching their already inadequate supply lines to the breaking point, then hold them in place while Allied air power cut them to pieces. When the Japanese 15th, 31st, and 33rd Divisions attacked in March 1944, they made impressive initial gains. Japanese soldiers, carrying 80-pound packs and with minimal vehicular support, crossed the Chindwin River on hastily constructed bamboo rafts and improvised bridges. They infiltrated through supposed British defensive lines, appearing behind headquarters units and supply depots, causing panic and confusion. By April, Japanese forces had surrounded both Imphal and Kohima. In Kohima, a small British and Indian garrison held a tiny perimeter. The battle literally took place around the Deputy Commissioner's tennis court, with Japanese forces on one side and British on the other, fighting over a piece of ground 100 yards across. For a brief moment, it looked like Yugo might actually succeed. Then reality set in. Allied air superiority, which Mutaguchi had dismissed as irrelevant, proved absolutely decisive. C-47 Dakota transport aircraft, the same planes that had dropped paratroopers over Normandy, flew continuous supply missions into Imphal and Kohima. Every day, regardless of weather, Allied aircraft delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and even reinforcements via glider. The surrounded British and Indian forces didn't starve. They were resupplied by air, while Japanese forces, who'd expected to capture British stocks, starved. The monsoon rains came early in mid-April, turning every road and trail into rivers of mud. Japanese artillery, already inadequate and short of ammunition, couldn't move forward. Supply trucks broke down and couldn't be replaced. Rations ran out. Soldiers began eating grass, tree bark, anything they could find. Disease swept through Japanese ranks like wildfire. Malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, beriberi from malnutrition. Men died by the hundreds, then thousands, not from British bullets but from starvation and disease. Japanese field hospitals, already overwhelmed and undersupplied, became charnel houses. Wounded soldiers lay in the mud, untreated, their wounds festering in the tropical heat and humidity. There were no antibiotics, no morphine, no sulfa drugs. Men with treatable wounds died screaming from gangrene and infection. The fighting itself was absolutely savage. At Kohima, combat was literally hand-to-hand. Grenades thrown from 15 yards, bayonet charges across open ground. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight to the death rather than surrender, launched banzai charges into British machine gun fire night after night. Corpses piled up in no man's land, rotting in the heat, the stench overwhelming. British and Indian forces, initially on the defensive, began counterattacking in May. Fresh divisions arrived by air and road. Tanks, Lee Grant medium tanks that Japanese forces had no effective weapons to counter, rolled forward, their 75mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns destroying Japanese positions with impunity. Japanese forces, starving and out of ammunition, fought with extraordinary courage and determination. Individual soldiers held positions against overwhelming odds. Officers led their men in charges that everyone knew were suicide. The code of Bushido, the warrior's way, demanded that death was preferable to surrender. But courage couldn't stop tanks. Determination couldn't conjure ammunition from thin air. Bushido couldn't fill empty stomachs. In June, with casualties mounting and the operational situation hopeless, even Mutaguchi had to acknowledge reality. He ordered a general withdrawal back across the Chindwin River. The retreat was a nightmare that would scar Japanese survivors for the rest of their lives. Thousands of wounded soldiers, unable to walk, were left behind. Japanese military doctrine had no provision for the care of prisoners or wounded who couldn't keep pace with the retreat. Officers shot their own wounded men rather than leave them for the British. Some wounded soldiers committed suicide with grenades. Others were simply abandoned to die in the jungle. The trails back to the Chindwin became a highway of death. Bodies lined the route for miles. Soldiers who died from wounds, disease, starvation, or simple exhaustion. The route became known as the White Bone Road for the skeletal remains that marked it. British and Indian forces, pressing the pursuit, found scenes that shocked even veteran soldiers. One British officer described finding a field hospital where wounded Japanese soldiers lay in rows, most dead, some still clinging to life, all abandoned. Another unit discovered a trail where the trees were marked with the names and final messages of soldiers who'd stopped to die. Of the 85,000 Japanese soldiers who invaded India in March 1944, fewer than 30,000 made it back across the Chindwin River by August. It was the single worst defeat in Imperial Japanese Army history, worse than Guadalcanal, worse than Nomonhan, worse than any battle Japan had fought. The casualty figures were staggering. Approximately 55,000 dead, most from starvation and disease rather than combat. For comparison, the entire U.S. Marine Corps suffered roughly 19,000 killed in action during the entire Pacific War. Japan lost 3 times that number in 4 months fighting for 2 small cities in eastern India. The operational lessons were clear to anyone willing to see them. Japan could not win a war of attrition against Allied material superiority. Japanese soldiers were brave, skilled, and determined, but courage alone couldn't overcome the reality of Allied logistics, air power, and industrial capacity. And that's when Imperial General Headquarters sent Colonel Masanobu Tsuji to Burma. In September 1944, Tsuji arrived at the headquarters of the 33rd Army in northern Burma with orders to stabilize the situation. The 33rd Army was positioned to face Chinese forces advancing from the north and east, part of General Joseph Stilwell's Northern Combat Area Command. These weren't just Chinese troops. They were American-trained, American-equipped divisions with American advisors, supported by American artillery and American air power, and they had American half-tracks. The M3 half-track was a beast of a vehicle. 20 feet long, powered by a 147-horsepower White engine, it could carry 13 men across terrain that would bog down conventional trucks. But more importantly for the gunners, it mounted a 50-caliber Browning M2 machine gun on an armored pulpit mount over the front passenger seat, with additional 30-caliber machine guns along the sides. The 50 cal was a monster. It fired armor-piercing rounds at 450 to 550 rounds per minute, with an effective range of nearly 2,000 yards. Against lightly armored Japanese vehicles, it was absolutely devastating. American and Chinese-American composite units, including elements of the 475th Infantry Regiment and Chinese divisions of the X-Force, used these half-tracks as mobile fire support, reconnaissance vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. In the dense Burmese jungle, they gave Allied forces a crucial advantage: mobility combined with overwhelming firepower. Tsuji, for all his tactical brilliance, was operating with resources that were a shadow of what he'd commanded in Malaya. The 33rd Army was undermanned, undersupplied, and facing an enemy with complete air superiority and mechanical advantages that Japan simply couldn't match. Japanese staff cars were civilian vehicles with minimal armor modifications. Japanese trucks were breaking down. Japanese communication equipment was spotty at best. But Tsuji, being Tsuji, he refused to stay at headquarters. This was a man who'd bathed under fire in the front trenches to calm panicking troops, who'd personally led reconnaissance missions deep behind enemy lines, who celebrated his 42nd birthday on October 11, 1944, in the front lines near Monyu, picking bracken sprouts for dinner in our headquarters in the bamboo groves. He was constantly on the move, visiting forward positions, coordinating defenses, inspecting units, and he traveled in whatever vehicle was available. Which brings us back to November 17, 1944, and that muddy jungle road. Sergeant McCarthy's M3 half-track was part of a 3-vehicle patrol operating north of Bamo, where the 33rd Army was desperately trying to establish a defensive line. Intelligence had reported Japanese command elements in the area, but nobody expected to actually encounter a staff car in broad daylight. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. McCarthy's 50 cal tore into the lead Japanese vehicle first. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the thin metal skin of the Nissan Type 180 like it was rice paper. Each round carried 647 grains of hardened steel and incendiary compound, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. When they struck, they didn't just penetrate, they obliterated. The first rounds hit low, tearing through the engine compartment. Coolant sprayed in a green mist. Oil ignited in yellow flames. The engine seized with a grinding shriek of tortured metal. The driver, a young lieutenant from Tsuji's staff, took a round through the left shoulder that nearly severed his arm. He lost control immediately, the vehicle swerving hard right, one wheel dropping into the drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. The Nissan tipped at a 45-degree angle, its momentum carrying it forward even as it ground against the ditch wall. Mud sprayed up in brown plumes. The rear door flew open, either from the impact or from someone inside desperate to escape. 2 officers jumped from the rear compartment, one of them clutching a leather map case and what looked like a field telephone in a canvas bag. Both wore the standard olive-drab officer's uniform with riding boots and sword belts. One was a major. McCarthy could see the twin stars on his collar even at this distance. The other's rank insignia was obscured, but the way the major stayed close to him suggested senior leadership. Both men hit the ground running, their boots slipping in the mud as they sprinted for the tree line 30 yards away. The major was limping badly, possibly injured in the crash, possibly just middle-aged and not accustomed to running for his life. The second half-track, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Hendricks, a 23-year-old former engineering student from Ohio State, swung wide to the left, its white engine roaring as the driver, Corporal Miguel Santos from Texas, muscled the 7-ton vehicle through the mud. The half-track's tracks bit deep, finding purchase where wheels would have spun useless. Hendricks's gunner, Sergeant First Class William Billy Kowalski, a Polish immigrant from Pittsburgh with 3 years in the Army, opened up with both the 50 cal and the 2 side-mounted 30 caliber Browning M19 19A4s. All 3 weapons firing simultaneously created a wall of lead that turned the air between the half-track and the fleeing Japanese officers into a killing zone. Kowalski was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily. He'd learned his trade killing German Afrika Korps soldiers across the desert at El Alamein. He didn't waste ammunition on suppressive fire or warning shots. Every burst was aimed, calculated, lethal. The Seforhi 50 cal rounds caught the major first. One took him in the lower back, the hydrostatic shock from the massive round essentially liquefying his internal organs. He went down face first in the mud, his map case flying from his hands, papers scattering in the wind, dead before he hit the ground. The second officer made it another 5 yards. A burst from one of the 30 cals stitched across his legs, shredding both femurs. He collapsed, tried to crawl, then took another burst across the upper torso that killed him instantly. The crossfire was absolutely devastating. In the confined space of that jungle road, with the half-track's elevation advantage and overlapping fields of fire, the 2 Japanese officers never had a chance. The third half-track, commanded by Staff Sergeant Raymond Ray Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa with ice water in his veins and a Distinguished Service Cross from Guadalcanal on his chest, pushed forward aggressively, its gunner covering the tree line, while Johnson prepared to dismount his squad to secure the vehicles and retrieve whatever documents and equipment they could find. The squad consisted of 9 men, 6 riflemen armed with M1 Garands, 1 bar gunner, 1 medic, and Johnson himself with a Thompson submachine gun. They were veterans of the Burma campaign, having fought their way down from Myitkyina over the past 6 months. They knew the drill: fast in, grab what you can, fast out before Japanese reinforcements arrive. Johnson was already on the radio. "All able elements, this is Able 3. Dismounting now to secure enemy vehicle. Keep those guns hot and watch our flanks." His men were dropping from the rear of the half-track, spreading into a tactical formation, when the Japanese rearguard opened fire. From concealed positions in the tree line, spider holes and hastily dug foxholes that the Americans hadn't spotted in the vegetation, Japanese infantry with Type 99 rifles, and at least 1, possibly 2 Type 92 heavy machine guns, unleashed a wall of lead at the American vehicles. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, nicknamed the Woodpecker by Allied forces for its distinctive sound, fired 7 7mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute from a 30-round strip. In the hands of a trained crew, it was a devastatingly accurate weapon, and the Japanese crews manning these guns were anything but green. They'd been fighting in Burma for months, perfecting the art of the ambush. The first burst caught Private First Class Danny Morrison, the bar gunner, across the chest. He went down hard, his Browning automatic rifle clattering to the road. The medic, Corporal James Doc Williams, a soft-spoken kid from Georgia who'd been pre-med at Emory before the war, scrambled toward him under fire. 2 crewmen in McCarthy's half-track were hit almost simultaneously. Private First Class Chen, the radio man, took a round through the left bicep that shattered the humerus. He screamed, dropped the radio handset, and slumped against the side of the vehicle, clutching his arm. Lance Corporal Thomas Riley, one of the side gunners, took a round that punched through the thin armor just below the gunner's ring mount and caught him in the abdomen. He collapsed into the crew compartment, bleeding badly. Rounds clanged off the armored sides of all 3 half-tracks like hammers on anvils. Some punched through the 6 to 12mm armor plate, barely enough to stop rifle fire at range, completely inadequate against sustained heavy machine gun fire at close quarters. Others ricocheted at wild angles, whining off into the jungle. Tracer rounds left orange streaks through the humid air. The characteristic crack-crack of Japanese 7mm rounds filled the air, punctuated by the deeper thump-thump-thump of the American 50 cals returning fire. Lieutenant Hendricks made the call. "Back, back, get us out of here!" The half-tracks reversed, their gunners laying down suppressive fire as they withdrew. The 50 cals thundered, chewing up the tree line where the Japanese positions were hidden. Leaves and branches exploded in showers of green. Bark flew from tree trunks. The noise was absolutely deafening. But in those 90 seconds, they'd done the damage. 2 Japanese staff cars destroyed, 4 officers dead or seriously wounded, maps and operational documents scattered in the mud, later recovered by a follow-up patrol. Was Colonel Tsuji in one of those vehicles? That's the question that haunted American intelligence for weeks afterward. The bodies recovered from the scene included a lieutenant colonel and 2 majors, all staff officers of the 33rd Army. The documents recovered included operational plans for the defense of Bamo and troop movement schedules. It was a significant intelligence coup. But Tsuji himself? He was reported alive and active at 33rd Army headquarters just days later, coordinating the desperate defense of Bamo as Stilwell's forces closed in. Here's what we know for certain. Tsuji was in the Bamo area during this exact time period. He was serving as a liaison officer, and historical records confirm he was, as usual, in the front trench. The 33rd Army fought a delaying action at Bamo that delayed the Allied advance for weeks, buying time for other Japanese units to withdraw. But the incident had a profound psychological impact on the Japanese forces. For the first time, senior staff officers realized they were genuinely vulnerable to American mobile firepower. Half-tracks could appear anywhere, anytime, with devastating speed and firepower. Japanese vehicles designed for the roads of Manchuria and China were sitting ducks against 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. Command protocols changed almost immediately. Officers stopped traveling in small, unescorted convoys. Movement during daylight hours was minimized. Radio silence became absolute. The freewheeling command style that Tsuji had employed in Malaya, where he'd race from position to position in a staff car, was no longer viable in Burma. The Americans had changed the game. The M3 half-tracks, which the troops had initially nicknamed Purple Heart Boxes because of their vulnerability to artillery, proved absolutely lethal in the mobile warfare of the Burma jungle. They could move faster than Japanese troops could retreat, hit harder than Japanese light armor could withstand, and disappear before heavy weapons could be brought to bear. Between October 1944 and January 1945, American and Chinese forces equipped with half-tracks destroyed an estimated 200 Japanese vehicles in northern Burma. Dozens of staff cars, supply trucks, and light tanks were left burning along jungle roads. Command and control for Japanese forces became increasingly difficult as officers were killed or forced to hole up in fixed headquarters. The 33rd Army fought skillfully but was steadily pushed back. On October 16, 1944, Stilwell launched his final offensive. British divisions from the west, Chinese from the north and east, all converging on the 33rd Army's positions. Tsuji coordinated a fighting withdrawal, conducting a desperate stand at Bamo to buy time. The battle for Bamo lasted from November 1944 until December 15th, when Chinese forces finally broke through. Even then, the 33rd Army conducted an orderly retreat to Lashio, not abandoning the position until January 30th, 1945. Tsuji's defensive operations in Burma showcased his tactical skill. Despite overwhelming Allied advantages in firepower, air support, and logistics, the 33rd Army inflicted significant casualties and delayed the Allied advance by months. But it was a delaying action, nothing more. The Allies had secured the land route from India to China. The strategic objective was achieved. For Tsuji, it was his last combat command of the war. In May 1945, with Burma lost and the war clearly ending, Imperial General Headquarters sent Tsuji to Bangkok with a futile mission: organize Thai resistance to the approaching Allies. It was a meaningless assignment, and Tsuji knew it. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, Tsuji didn't return to face Allied justice. He went into hiding. For 4 years, he moved through Southeast Asia like a ghost. He wore Buddhist monk robes. He worked for Chinese intelligence as both prisoner and employee. He visited Vietnam, which was erupting in anti-French insurgency, and some historians believe he advised the Viet Minh on guerrilla tactics. His fingerprints certainly seemed to be on some of their operations. The Allies desperately wanted to prosecute Tsuji for war crime: the Bataan Death March, the Suk Ching massacres, the murder and cannibalism of Allied airmen, but he was never apprehended. Other officers who'd followed his orders were tried and executed. General Masaharu Homa, who'd actually countermanded many of Tsuji's execution orders as dishonorable violations of Bushido, was executed by firing squad while Tsuji roamed free. In 1949, with the Tokyo trials concluded and occupation authorities focusing on rebuilding Japan rather than hunting fugitives, Tsuji quietly returned to Japan. And here's where the story gets truly bizarre. In 1952, Tsuji was elected to the Japanese Diet, the national parliament. He served for 9 years as an ultra-nationalist politician, advocating for Japanese rearmament and denouncing American occupation policies. He founded a military rearmament society. He wrote best-selling memoirs about his wartime experiences, including his masterwork on the Malaya Campaign. The man who'd orchestrated mass murder, who'd eaten the flesh of an executed prisoner, who'd evaded justice for war crimes that sent other men to the gallows, became a respected member of parliament. American intelligence kept a file on him. The CIA noted his continued contacts with nationalist movements across Asia. There were reports he maintained relationships with figures like Indonesian leader Sukarno and South Korean strongman Park Chung-hee, both of whom claimed inspiration from his Pan-Asian ideology. Then, in April 1961, Tsuji told colleagues he was traveling to Laos on a private research trip. He met with Katsumi Akasaka, a former military man with connections to the Pathet Lao communist movement. The two drove by jeep to a suburb north of Vientiane. Tsuji, wearing Buddhist monk robes again, slipped away. Masanobu Tsuji was never seen again. After 7 years, the Japanese government officially declared him dead. But no body was ever found. No confirmed sighting was ever verified. Theories abound. Some believe he was trying to retrieve a cache of gold bars allegedly hidden from Japanese Army headquarters in Bangkok in 1945. Others think he was attempting one last adventure to revive his political career. One unconfirmed report claimed he was seen boarding a Soviet plane bound for Hanoi. A British military historian wrote in 1968 that information from Japan indicated Tsuji was serving as an operations staff officer under Vietnamese General Von Nguyen Giap. When one considers the ruthless brilliance of the North Vietnamese operations, the historian noted, the hand of Masanobu Tsuji can be seen clearly. Whether that's true, we'll likely never know. What we do know is this: Colonel Masanobu Tsuji represented one of the great contradictions of World War II, a tactical genius who could plan operations with breathtaking creativity and precision, a charismatic leader who inspired fanatical loyalty in his followers, a Pan-Asianist who genuinely believed in liberating Asia from Western colonialism, and simultaneously, a war criminal responsible for tens of thousands of deaths. A fanatic who believed the ends always justified the means, no matter how brutal. A man so dangerous that even his own superiors feared what he might do. The engagement on that muddy Burmese road in November 1944 symbolizes something larger. It was the moment when Japanese tactical excellence, embodied by officers like Tsuji, met the overwhelming material superiority that America brought to the Pacific War. No amount of brilliant planning could overcome the reality of American industrial might. Those M3 half-tracks, with their .50 caliber Brownings, represented a war machine that Japan simply couldn't match. By late 1944, America was producing weapons, vehicles, and ammunition at a rate that dwarfed Japanese capacity. Every engagement became more lopsided. Every battle cost Japan resources it couldn't replace. Tsuji knew this. In his memoirs, he acknowledged that Japan's defeat wasn't due to the character of its people or soldiers, but to a weaker national economy and industrial base. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories, the shipyards, the supply chain. But even knowing this, men like Tsuji kept fighting, kept planning, kept believing that one more brilliant maneuver, one more desperate stand, might change the outcome. It never did. The half-tracks rolled on. The B-29s flew higher. The submarines cut deeper. And slowly, inevitably, the Empire of Japan was ground to dust by an industrial colossus it should never have challenged. Today, exactly 80 years later, we can look back at the Burma campaign and see it for what it was. A brutal, grinding war of attrition where technological superiority, logistical excellence, and sheer material abundance overwhelmed tactical skill and fanatical determination. The Japanese 33rd Army in Burma fought with extraordinary courage and discipline. They delayed the Allied advance through impossible jungle terrain, inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. Officers like Tsuji employed every trick in the book to maximize their limited resources, but they were fighting with Model T Fords against Sherman tanks, with bolt-action rifles against semi-automatic Garands, with horse-drawn artillery against motorized columns. The engagement that day in November 1944 wasn't unusual. Across Burma, the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, similar scenes played out thousands of times. American firepower, delivered by vehicles like the M3 half-track, systematically destroyed Japanese command and control, logistics, and morale. Sergeant McCarthy, the half-track gunner who may or may not have nearly killed the most notorious Japanese staff officer of the war, survived Burma and returned home to Pennsylvania. He rarely spoke about the war. Years later, when asked about that particular engagement, he said simply, "We hit what we were aiming at. That's what we were trained to do." Chow Par. It was that workmanlike professionalism, multiplied across millions of American servicemen, that won the war in the Pacific. Not dramatic heroics, not brilliant stratagems, just overwhelming force, applied with grinding consistency, day after day, until Japanese resistance collapsed. As for Colonel Tsuji, wherever he ended up, whether in an unmarked grave in Laos, advising communist insurgents in Vietnam, or living out his days under an assumed name in some remote Asian village, he took with him the secrets of Japan's war machine. And perhaps that's fitting, because Tsuji, more than almost anyone, embodied both the brilliance and the horror of Imperial Japan's war, the tactical innovation and the mass murder, the dedication and the fanaticism, the dream of Pan-Asian liberation and the reality of brutal occupation. He was a man of extraordinary contradictions who lived through extraordinary times and left a legacy that still provokes fierce debate among historians 80 years later. The American half-track crews who faced him in Burma didn't know or care about any of that. They had a job to do: destroy enemy vehicles, support the advance, win the war. And that's exactly what they did. If you found this deep dive into Colonel Tsuji's Burma campaign and the brutal reality of mechanized jungle warfare compelling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We've got more stories like this coming, including detailed examinations of the Malaya campaign, the Guadalcanal disaster, and other forgotten battles of the Pacific War. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Tsuji's story. Was he a brilliant tactician whose genius was wasted in an unjust war? A monster who deserved to hang alongside the other war criminals? Or something more complicated than either of those labels allows? History isn't black and white. It's 1,000 shades of gray, written in blood and mud on jungle roads where American half-tracks faced Japanese staff cars, and the outcome of empires hung in the balance. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember, the price of freedom is paid by those who roll forward into the fire, whether on 2 tracks or 4 wheels, doing the job that history demands of them.